So first of all, I'd like to thank Nikolas Papadimitriou, who's director of the Paul and Alexandra Canellopoulos Museum in Athens, and Georgios Sanidas of the University of Lille for inviting me to give this seminar, this talk. The museum, the Canellopoulos Museum, is actually one of my favorite museums in Greece, or actually in the world. I think it's a lovely museum, and it's a really great joy to visit, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity to work with them on something. Nikos was very, very generous in what he was saying about me. I think I should add a little bit of history to this, just briefly, of how I got into this rather strange topic of ancient jewelry technology. It actually started with this guy. This is not me. I'm not quite that old. This is a photograph of my great-grandfather in the 1913, I think, in Egypt. He was a jeweler, family jewelry business, but he was also an amateur archaeologist and very, very keen on traveling in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, looking at ancient things. He died a long time before I was born, but years later, the attics and one of the buildings was being cleared out, and they found a couple of things of his, one of which was a book, which was gold, silver jewelry that was in the collections of the New York Historical Society, which was the first book that had ever been written on the technology of early gold jewelry. This is Egyptian jewelry, published in 1924. And because I'd had an interest in archaeology since the age of 7, I was, I think, 13 when this book was handed to me saying, "Oh, you're interested in this stuff. We've just found it. Why don't you have it?" And there was also a little box of what archaeologists would call tomb sweepings that my great-grandfather had collected, including a little gold earring. And so with this sort of earring and a magnifying glass, which every jewelry family has lots lying around, and the book, I was able to understand how things were made, and this sort of started me. So it's, I mean, Nikolas said more than 45 years, which is actually over 60 years now since I first put a piece of ancient gold under magnification. And he also kindly mentioned my book, which is coming out next spring. And I think it's quite interesting because it's coming out in 2024, which is exactly 100 years after the New York Historical Society catalogue, which sort of, if you like, launched me on this whole thing. So it's very apt. Anyway, let's move on. Greek jewelry, to talk about the skills of the Greek goldsmith. I mean, where do you start? First of all, you have a huge heritage of gold work, Greek gold work, from going right back before 3000 BC, right up to modern times. I mean, here we have just typical examples. We have the a set of very early Bronze Age pendants, what they used to call the Chalcolithic period, dating back probably 4,000 years or more, 4,000 BC or more. We have the pair of earrings in the Canellopoulos Museum, the ones that we used on the poster for this lecture, and a wonderful piece, this bracelet, which you probably know of the 10th century AD in Thessaloniki, in the Byzantine Museum there. So there's a huge range chronologically. So where do you start? Obviously, one could start with the pieces that were on the poster and use something like this, just as an example, for looking at styles of Greek jewelry. For example, we can look at these beautiful little pair of earrings, disc earrings with pendants in the form of eros, winged eros. And we can say there are others. These are a pair, dare I say, slightly finer quality ones in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There are many of these eros earrings. I think I must have looked at, several dozen pairs in my life, and they're all slightly different. So one could start to build up a stylistic comparison, maybe work out the chronologies or relationships and so on. That's one aspect of jewelry you can look at. You can say, where did they get the ideas? Where did the Greek goldsmith decide to make a figure of eros? Where did the idea come from? What was his model, if you like? What was he copying from? Well, there are other sources, of course. Art is not in a vacuum. Goldsmiths had other things around them. And for example, the terracotta of eros might have formed a model, if you like, for producing the earring. But it's more complicated than that, if you think about it, because this is a bracelet. This is in the Met in New York, lion head terminals. Now, we can't imagine that the Greek goldsmith wandered off to the local zoo and sketched lions. I mean, this didn't happen. So how did he get a good idea of what a lion looked like close up? because lions were very common in Greek jewellery, like this pair of earrings, again, in the late 4th century BC. How did they know what a lion looked like? What was the model for this? Well, there are various theories here. I mean, one possibility, of course, is coinage. Coinage circulated and formed a wonderful sort of selection of things that you could, a goldsmith could get an idea and say, oh, I can copy that. So one possibility is that goldsmiths around the Greek Empire copied things they saw on coins. At the top right there's this earring, an earring in the form of a sphinx, a seated sphinx. It would have been based on a coin. So we can look at a piece like this. We might know where it came from. We can do what people generally do with ancient jewelry and say, isn't it pretty? Isn't it cleverly made? And how much is it worth? Which is what, of course, brings people into exhibitions. But to look deeper, we need to look into how it was made. What was the manufacturing of this? For example, with these, we can study and we can find that in Munich, in the museum in Munich, there's a bronze, what they call a forma. It's a piece of bronze with the shapes of the two halves of the Sphinx figure for a similar earring. So you'd press a sheet gold over these two, so you'd have the two halves, you could fit together and then add all these other decorations on, making a pair of earrings. So you can look at the manufacturing side of jewelry. You can look at Greek jewelry in particular and how it acted as a, if you like, a sort of starting point for some things. For example, we look at Mycenaean gold rings. I mean, some of the finest early rings in the world are Mycenaean Greek gold, wonderfully made and wonderful iconography. But also, if we look a little closer, such as this Mycenaean ring from the Ogden treasure, you can actually see the use of what we call shallow groove engraving. This is actually engraving where the metal is cut out with a tool, possibly suggesting the use of iron tools, but that's still being debated. But this technique of true engraving like this is where it first appears in the ancient world, as far as we know. It's not seen in Egypt at this period. We're going back, sort of in rough approximate terms, sort of 1500 BC. It's not found in Egypt, it's not found in Western Asia. This seems to be a Greek first. So we can sort of see where Greek technology plays a part in the world. And then we can jump to the early Iron Age in Greece, where we also find engraving. This is a beautiful brooch, about the 8th century BC, Greek brooch. Now we all talk about sort of a Greek Dark Age, a period between the fall of the Mycenaean civilization and the sort of reappearance, if you like, of sophisticated society after the 9th, 10th century BC. So was there really a Dark Age? Well, the interesting thing is that things like engraving bridge that gap. We have engraving in Greece on gold before the so-called Dark Age. We have it after the so-called Dark Age. Nowhere else that early. Nowhere else in the ancient world. So this shows a continuity. Maybe links with Northern Europe more than the Middle East. We don't know yet, but there's work in progress. So we can look at things like that when we study jewellery, what there is and what the chronological and geographical information we get. It's also important to look at jewellery and think how it survives, not just in terms of lying in the ground for few thousand years, but actually in ancient societies. For example, we all know this piece, the pendant in the form of two hornets or wasps. People are still debating what kind of insect these are, from Crete. Dates back to somewhere around about 1700 BC. And this is in every book on Greek jewellery, of course. There might even be a stamp with it on, which is the kind of, if you're a piece of ancient gold, if you appear on a stamp, then it shows you've made it in the world. A famous piece like this. But if you actually, rather than just say how beautiful it is, rather than telling the object what we think it is and how beautiful we think it is, we start asking the questions about why, asking the object questions. That's when we start to learn things. For example, I had this piece, luckily I was able to get this piece under a microscope a few years ago in Crete. I had a look at it. And the first thing that struck me was, where are the antennae, the little things on top of the heads? Now, the insects are beautifully produced, beautifully rendered here. but they're anatomically incorrect, aren't they? Because there's no antennae on the head. So, but if you look closer, you might not be able to see in a photograph, but you could under a microscope. This whole top piece was much cruder manufacture, rather flooded silver inside, and not very well made at all. And I think it's highly likely that this piece was added later. I'm not sure, I don't mean in modern times, I think it's an ancient repair. So there's all these wonderful things of how, about the history of a piece, what happened during its lifetime. So there are many aspects to looking at ancient gold, the way it was made and the way it was used and everything else. What about the goldsmiths themselves? Well, from the Greek world, we don't know that much. There are a few Greek goldsmiths named, but not many. Very few items that have a name on that could be a goldsmith. One piece, this is actually in Naples, it's in the museum, this is found in Italy, but it's a ring with two different colored gold, which is quite unusual. It dates again to around about 200, 300 BC, but it actually has the name on the back that says, oh, sorry, on the top, made by Heraclitus. Heraclitus made it. So there's a Greek goldsmith working in Italy actually signing, whether he made the whole ring or just the paler gold insert, we don't know. It's very different with engraved gems. This is I think, one of the greatest engraved gems from the ancient world. This is a Greek ring, blue chalcedony engraving, flying heron, and it's signed by Daxamenos, one of the greatest engravers. Dates about 450 BC, but it's absolutely superb work of art. Engravers were celebrated, and we have their names, such as Alexandra here. Workshops, we have very little information about. There's no representations of Greek goldsmiths' workshops, as far as I know. In Egypt, we have various representations over the years. And in fact, the only representation we have, sort of, if you like, the same period as the Greek period, of the period of 4th century BC, is from Egypt. It's a wall relief, painted wall relief from the tomb of Petosiris at Hermopolis in Egypt, late 4th century BC. And this shows goldsmiths working, producing various types of vessels. You can see with their little chisels, a hand with hammers there, working on these objects. Not jewellery, but gold work. We have a little bit of information about Greek goldsmiths in texts. Not many formal texts, but there are a couple of plays, early Greek plays that mention goldsmiths and various plots. And of course, going right back to Homer in the Odyssey. Here, this is the King Nestor. This is a 19th century representation of the scene. King Nestor wanted to sacrifice the cow to the goddess Athene, and he wanted the horns gilded. And apparently there's a normal practice to gild the horns of sacrificial animals. He wanted the horns gilded, and so, Homer tells us, he asked for the goldsmith, summoned the goldsmith to come, and the goldsmith came, and Nestor supplied the goldsmith with the gold. And that is a process, a practice that seems to have gone right on until modern times. Often the goldsmith would visit the customer, and the customer would supply the gold. Even in modern times, this has happened. The goldsmith is supplied by the customer. The only good representation we have of the goldsmith of about this period is the famous wall painting from Pompeii in the 1st century AD, which shows little figures of Eros acting out, working in the goldsmith's workshop. I suppose, seeing as we're talking about Canellopoulos, the earrings with Eros on it, makes suitable to have the goldsmith as Eros. But here we can see them hammering out gold or silver there. What is possibly the customer there? You can see the customer in the middle. The balances, everything was sold by weight. Very important to have weights. Delicate tapping going on there, making some little piece of jewellery. And on the far side there, on the far right, we have a furnace with figure blowing, probably for soldering or melting gold, likely soldering there, which I'll talk about a little later. The chronological development of Greek jewellery I can't talk about today because there's too much of it. It goes right through. This is, as you know, an early Minoan wall painting, and we have a Meissen earring in Athens, which is very, very similar. Wonderful example. So we can compare jewellery with representations of wearers, which is a good way of dating jewellery, of course. Something like this, which is pretty early in the Bronze Age, through to Hellenistic period. This is again actually from Italy, but it's a very Greek-style Hellenistic jewellery being worn. And the similarity between the surviving jewellery and what you can see this woman wearing on a funerary sarcophagus is really extremely close representation. And terracotta as well. Here we have a figure, look, Eros earrings. So with those we can compare with the ones we're talking about, Canellopoulos earrings. So I can't talk about the historical development of Greek jewellery, it's too much. I can't talk about all manufacturing technology or all we know about goldsmiths. There's too much to talk about. So I was thinking, what do I really talk about? And the answer is just to talk about one piece of jewellery, this pair of earrings. It was on the poster, seemed a wonderful opportunity to talk about something that's actually in the Canellopoulos Museum. So let's talk about it. We can narrow it down even more. Let's just talk about the top. How was this made? It's quite elaborate. We can see it's slightly out of focus, but you can see the, rather nice filigree work there. So how was this made? Well, we can start off with a simple little, if you like, a little dish of gold, hammered out, made out of sheet gold. This is like the plate or the dish, if you like, the disc of the earring. The decoration inclusive of what they call a beaded wire, which goes inside like that, and a plain wire that goes inside beaded wire. Now, I haven't told you how they made beaded wire, because I can't tell you that until I tell you how plain wire was made. So you've got the beaded wire and the plain wire. And you'll notice in my drawing here, there's little lines here, little diagonal lines. There's a reason for those, because if you look at early gold jewellery, you'll see that gold wire has these diagonal lines on it. That's an example. That's actually, it's about 3rd century BC, but from South Russia. And this is a little earlier piece. But again, you see these diagonal lines, these seams. It's clearly twisted, isn't it? And this is how it was made. This is how they made wires, round circular wires. Take a strip of gold, go twist it just between your fingers, twist it tighter and tighter and tighter. And it's a sort of physical thing that if you tighten it, eventually it goes into a nice little regular coil. Tighten as much as you can, and then roll it between two flat surfaces. When you've done that, you have a perfect wire. And it is extremely regular and very circular. And they can do very small diameters. There's an incredible earring. There's only a single earring, unfortunately, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And it's this siren here. Notice the non-human legs and wings, but the strings of her, the kithara or the lute she's playing, the wire, these are strip twist wires, but 0.1 millimeter in diameter. So it's pretty small, isn't it? This kind of wire, the strip twist wire, fell out of use in medieval times. It was replaced by a technique called wire drawing. And here we have one of the earliest representations. Here you have an iron plate with holes in it, different size holes, and you pull the gold or silver or copper through one of the holes, then through a slightly smaller hole, through a smaller hole, until you get it to the size you want. This is called wire drawing. It presupposes certain things, good steel or good iron anyway, good hard iron. Even more important, rarely good tongs, because they have to be able to hang on to it. And here you see the guy is sitting on a swing. This is not recreational. He can put his feet on the tree stump here and get a lot of pressure, a lot of power behind his pull. He can really pull the wire through. So this dates to 1425. It's a German representation of wire drawing, early wire drawing. The earliest mention of wire drawing in Europe is actually Greek. As far as I know so far, there's this piece on the right. This is a manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It's actually a 15th century copy of a 11th century manuscript of various metalworking recipes. One of the things in here mentions the drawing of wire. Not this page, but it does mention the drawing of wire. So we've got our wire, beaded wire now. how was the beaded wire made? The outside there. And it is, as you can see, looks like a series of beads, but it is a wire. And the way they made this was to roll a round section wire underneath a tool like this. There are various, I mean, this is one way of doing it. There are various ways of producing it, various profile tools, etc. But this is basically the way that beaded wire could be made. And it was made like this, really right through it into medieval times. It doesn't appear before about the 7th century BC, beaded wire. And it's possible that it came in the wake of the Iron Age, with the use of iron tools by goldsmiths made the sort of implements they needed either easier to produce or just improve the technique some way. So we've got the plain wire and we've got the beaded wire. Now it gets the interesting part, doesn't it? It's all the decoration inside. So here we have all the decoration to go into it. Now, at first glance, this looks like a little more beaded wire, but it isn't. It's a particular type of beaded wire. It's what they call spiral beaded wire. That sounds a bit technical, but this was made, it was generally used for narrower diameter wires when it was a bit too fiddly to make normal beaded wire. So what they did, they rolled a wire under a single edge, but at an angle. So it's almost like a screw thread along the wire. This is an example of a bracelet, about the same period as our earrings, somewhere in the late 4th century BC. And this is spiral beaded wire. And you can see here the seam, because the wire was made from a strip-drawn wire, then rolled under an edge to give it this look. Spiral beaded wire. And a lovely example here where it's been used to make a tapered spiral beaded wire. So we've got all these little bits now of spiral beaded wire. But before I put them in, if you like, put them into the earring, just wanted to look at this piece on the left. Rosette here. The rosette here is actually made out of a single piece of spiral beaded wire. It's not 6 separate little petals. It's a continuous length. This might seem more fiddly, but in fact, it was probably easier to produce with the equipment and the tools and the whatever they had at the time, easier to produce. And this was absolutely normal in Greek work. For example, this is a close-up of a far more elaborate Greek earring. And I think you can see here the very similar rosette, but again, you can see quite clearly it's one piece of wire going around. What I call running filigree, if you like. It just carries on. I think the gap's there. So it starts there and goes around and comes around to there. And even this acanthus leaf here, it's one piece. It goes all the way around. So this kind of running filigree, this running spiral beaded wire, very typical of the Greek world. Often not the same that fakers do it today. They tend to take different ways, but it's very typical of the Greek world. So we've got our wire decoration in there, this filigree decoration. There's now another piece of beaded wire that goes onto the rim, and like a cherry on the cake, a little grain in the middle of it. So this is the whole thing. This is the disc of the earring. Now that's just one disc on one of the earrings. You've also got the figures underneath, which were each made to be hammered. They're not cast, hammered out of gold with the wings and this garland, etc., and this kind of scarf they're wearing made separately. I say not cast. Casting was very, very unusual in the ancient world for gold, right through until medieval times. Curators and excavators and people are too often use the word cast. Anything that's slightly chunky and made of gold, they assume it's cast, but very seldom it's cast. Very, very seldom indeed. Altogether, these earrings use probably 100 or so components, separate components put together. So it's a lot of effort's gone into these. Now, I haven't been completely truthful of you because I showed you how you put all these little bits together. I didn't explain how you join them together. Today, I know we have some goldsmiths listening in, or they were, unless they've tuned out now. We have Arkes Goumas, of course, well-known Greek goldsmith, Tim McCreight, a goldsmith from the States, who's actually the publisher of my book coming out next year. And I think David Lopes, also a skilled replicator of early gold work, is also on the list of participants. So they'll know that today in the modern world, soldering is normally done with a narrow jet flame, very pointed flame. And here, I'm not quite sure what they're doing here. I mean, they're quite brave with the stone in, but the point is you can actually solder a minute area. You can solder a single granule in place with modern technology. Very different in the past. In the past, rather than heating one particular point of the piece, the whole piece was heated up, the entire object. It's more like this. Here we have two representations of goldsmiths from a long, long time apart. On the right, we have from the tomb of Rekhmir in Egypt, about 1400 BC, a goldsmith working. Here, sort of clay, little sort of furnace-y crucible thing, tongs, burning charcoal, and a blowpipe. And here, photographed in India in the 19th century, very, very similar scene. Clay, furnace, blowpipe, and tongs. This was how things were soldered. Not a little point of flame where you wanted it. The whole thing was brought up to temperature, or the whole component was brought up to temperature. We go back to our wall painting from Pompeii. This is exactly what we have here. Slightly more elaborate furnace, but the blowpipe and the tongs, very, very similar. And in fact, right up until the Renaissance, making jewellery or soldering jewellery was more like baking a pizza than modern gold working. And this is a Renaissance goldsmith at work with his furnace here, rather similar, if you like, to our Roman one here, just slightly bigger scale. It says it's like baking a pizza. The whole thing is brought up to temperature, the whole component. The soldering was being done, well, there were various ways it was being done, but one of the ways they did it so they can make a very little solder for doing things like wires, putting wires and grains in place, was a fascinating technique that we called copper salt soldering. This case is probably talking about baking a pizza, because we're actually starting off here with this our gold disc again, our dish here. So what the goldsmith needed really were basic substances, possibly something like copper acetate, which is very easy to make with copper and vinegar or fermenting grapes and so on, old wine, and a gum, a natural gum, or an organic glue that's water soluble. There are other ways of doing it, but this is one of the ways. Now, if you mix this into a little paste, this copper salt, we're using salt in the chemical sense, there's a copper compound with a water soluble glue, mix them together, and you then basically paint them onto the surface of where you're going to solder things on. You paint this mixture on, and then you apply the pieces into there. You then heat it in your furnace or over burning charcoal, bring it up to temperature, and something rather extraordinary happens. As the whole thing heats up, the copper acetate or other copper, the various copper substances could be used, but the coppery substance reduces, as they say in chemical terms, reduces to pure copper. So the pure copper, if you like, comes out of the copper compound. And then at about 890 degrees centigrade, it both sort of alloys with and diffuses into the gold. So it creates a solder actually at the point of contact. It's an extraordinary technique. Now, some ancient goldsmith wasn't sort of sitting in the bath trying to work out how they might be able to do this, come up with the idea with copper salts and reduction of things. No, it's a byproduct of something else, undoubtedly. The same coppery mixtures and gold were used for painting walls and putting on eye makeup and for glazing stones. So there's various other ways. It could have been an accident to start with, but there's very early on, probably 3000 BC, probably about 3000 BC, they discovered that this technique And it was certainly being used by before 2000 BC, what we call copper salt soldering. So we've now got the whole earring, haven't we? Or at least the whole disc on the top. Sorry, it keeps jumping ahead, my thing, my overactive mouse or something. Anyway, so we have the earrings. So I mentioned the grain in the middle, this time, if you like, the cherry on the cake in the middle of the disc. I think it's worth talking briefly about granulation, because this is granulation, and the earrings here we're talking about only have one grain each, so they're kind of sparsely granulated. But granulation is the use of these minute little gold balls as a decoration, and it's of considerable antiquity. This is one of the earliest sophisticated examples, which is from Troy, from treasure at Troy. This dates to about 2200 BC, maybe slightly earlier, I think now the chronology is suggesting. And you can notice wonderful rows of grains here, sort of what would have been a triangle up there. And notice also strip twist wire. I think you can probably just see the diagonal lines on the wire there. So this is one of the earliest sophisticated examples of granulation. And it's also the earliest examples I know from Troy of strip twist wire. Since sort of the beginning. It doesn't appear in Egypt this early and doesn't seem to appear in Western Asia quite this early. And granulation could be sophisticated in many different ways. This is relatively simple, isn't it? It's straight lines and a triangle. But think of this piece, this earring this is from Mycenae, of course, and we have in the back a Cretan wall painting, Minoan wall painting showing the very similar earring in Ware. What's interesting here is fairly sparse granulation, but if you notice, it's actually graduated. The grain in the middle there is big and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller to get to the back, which is an incredibly sophisticated thing, isn't it? It's really, really rather wonderful. And the other interesting thing about these earrings, which you can't really see in the photograph, but maybe I can zoom in there. I know there's some goldsmiths there. There's a spare grain there that must have slipped out of place, but you notice that the sheet gold has got wire supports behind it, which is a kind of very modern metalworking thing, isn't it? To actually roll the edge of the sheet over a wire. Quite an unusual process from antiquity. Talk about sophisticated granulation. Greek, this is from the Iron Age. Early Iron Age Greek jewellery, incredibly sophisticated granulation, very complicated. Because in fact, single lines of grains are very difficult, like we have here, are very difficult to produce, because you're putting the grains on in this kind of slightly sticky mixture, and they tend to clump together. Imagine, you've got some peas on your plate and it's in the sauce, all the peas will clump together. Same with granulation. To make a single line is actually quite complicated. So the Greeks were masters of this, and in many ways, I think they were, certainly up there with the Etruscans, always supposed to be the ultimate of granulation. But the Greeks were amazing. And if you want proof of that, look at these earrings. These are, again, we're all talking about the same period here. This is about the 4th century BC. Incredible. I mean, there are probably 1,000 or more separate components put together to form the earrings. The same idea, if you like, of the earrings from the Canellopoulos Museum we're talking about, a disc at the top, but obviously a slightly more elaborate pendant underneath. I don't have a close-up of these earrings, but a very similar pair will show you what the granulation is like. Look at these. The granulation are little diamond shapes of 4 grains space, but look how precisely they're aligned, the lines of grains. It really is a quite incredible work of art, isn't it? How they could do this. And I think at this point, one has to say that this sort of work was quite often probably done by small children. I know that's probably not sort of seen as correct these days, but children have small fingers, as we've known in the modern world, of course, with certain carpet weaving in parts of the world and that sort of thing, threading beads in India, China. But small fingers worked. And in fact, we don't have much information from the Greek world, but from Rome, we have funerary inscriptions and things that we know. One girl who was worked in gold died at the age of 9, already skilled gold worker. And a boy who died, I think it was at 12 years old, he was already skilled at setting gemstones. So they started young and they had small fingers. But this, I think, is probably the epitome of incredible granulation. Granulation was thought to be some mysterious thing. It was really only, just over 100 years ago. It was sort of the sort of copper salt technique was rediscovered. Nobody was quite sure how it was done, and so it gained this incredible mystique.
Υπάρχει άλλο microphone speaker.
Ξέρεις τι,
Δεν δουλεύει.
Δεν δουλεύει.
Μήπως δουλεύει το άλλο.
I got somebody else speaking there. There's another voice coming up. Okay. The secret to granulation is this copper salt. The actual granulation itself, it's not really that special. It's fiddly, but it's not that special. To make grains, it's quite easy. You cut little bits of gold using a little chisel or something, little bits of gold, and you heat them up, and they melt. And when they melt, they roll into little balls. This is surface tension. There's no skill involved. This is just surface tension. Makes them roll into balls, and they cool down, and you've got your grains. Now, you might need, if you're making a big pair of earrings, you might need several thousand of these. So it takes time, but it's not complicated. It's time-consuming, but not complicated. How do you fix these grains to the background? Well, as I said, with copper salt soldering. You stick the grains where you want them with this coppery mixture, heat them, the coppery mixture reduces to metallic copper, alloys with the gold, and you end up with grains in place. Now, the wonderful thing about this kind of soldering is that you can carry on doing it on the same object. With modern solders, if you buy what we call a solder alloy and make jewellery, if you solder a ring or solder a joint on something, you can't then use the same solder again on the same piece because it raises up the temperature. So you're soldering the second joint will make the first joint melt again. But with this copper salt soldering, you can carry on doing this over and over again, the same piece. Each time you solder it, it just gets, if you like, even more firmly attached. So you can build things up using this technique. And in fact, with things like these earrings, I think it's almost certain that these little diamond shapes were produced separately. Lots of these little diamond shapes was made, and then the diamond shapes were applied as little components onto the surface. That's quite possible with copper salt soldering, and it makes an awful lot of sense in the way it was to be done. The customer, there she is. I think it's a woman there sitting there buying something. It's being weighed to show what good value it is for the weight or something. That things were sold by weight. There's lots of references to that. And normally the profit margins for the jeweler were very low compared to modern terms. So you're basically buying jewellery by weight. So we can look at a piece of jewellery now, and we can work out how it was made, how it was constructed. But that's only part of, if you like, with jewellery historians' process, because you're looking at this and you can say, yes, I can make it. I mean, now, I've explained how it's done, so you could all go out and make this stuff tomorrow. But the answer is no. What's missing is experience and practice, isn't it? So the theory and the practice are very different things. But there's even another dimension, because think about it. We have a necklace like this. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It's Greek, from the Greek colonies in southern Italy. And we can work out how that chain, for example, here was made. It was made with these links. The links were soldered together separately and then interlinked together. So we know how that was made. But there are hundreds of these links to make the necklace. Now, if you remember, I said earlier on that the goldsmiths tended to work with gold supplied by the customers. You'd go to the goldsmith and say, here's some gold, make me a necklace. So you imagine that you go to the goldsmith and you say, right, here's some gold coins, make me a necklace. How does the goldsmith start to work out the diameter of the wire to make so that you can make a necklace like this and use up all the gold that's been produced? It's an incredibly complicated thing. How do you apportion the gold? How do you know how thick to make the wire so you can make the necklace long enough to actually be useful? And this is something we don't understand how it was done. And I think it just has to be experience, incredible amount of experience in making these things. What else can you tell from jewellery? Well, back to our favourite pieces here. We can look at them and we can notice things about them that is, if you like, it's another dimension onto technology. These are the tops of those two earrings. What you can notice straight away is they're not the same. Look at the size. I mean, the obvious thing is the size of the rosette. Very, very different. The basic pattern is the same. Rosette with the grain in the middle, scrolly bits, plain wire, spiral beaded wire, and so on. But there are differences. There are a different number of scrolls here, different number of petals in the rosette, and most notably, this is beaded wire, but here is actually thicker spiral beaded wire. In fact, both that and that are beaded wire here, but a spiral beaded wire here. These are made by two different goldsmiths. Now, and they're also slightly different sizes. So what we don't know is what are the circumstances? Was that one of the tops lost in antiquity and another one made? We really don't know. This is the intriguing thing. I mean, I must admit, I haven't had these earrings under a microscope. I haven't been able to have a close look at them yet. But what we don't know is whether one shows more wear than the other, whether there's any sign of repairs, and which was the original. If one is a replacement, which is the original? Also, look at the difference here. This wire's sort of gone off, hasn't it? It should have been in there. It's overlapping. So this seems slightly less carefully produced. And the fact they've used spiral beaded wire, which was a simpler way of doing it rather than spiral bead, suggests, I would guess, that this is the original. And this is a copy made by a slightly less skilled goldsmith. But there's all just hypothesis. But it shows the sort of thing that the jewellery historian is looking for when you look at gold. It's not just, aren't they beautiful? And so often, whether you look at books or go around museums, jewellery is pinned like a butterfly onto a board, and people tell the jewellery what they think of it. I think it's beautiful. It looks like this, or it reminds me of that. What the jewellery historian, I suppose any archaeologist should do, is say, what can it tell us? And there's always more things to observe and to think about. You'll remember this earring. I talked about this earring and how it was made from a sheet like this. I looked at a pair of these about a year ago, and just out of interest, they're also, one of them had been replaced. And these are the bases of the two earrings. And you see quite clearly, one has a huge amount of wear on it. It rarely shows a lot of wear. Must have been woman must have loved this and worn it all the time. Whereas the newer one, if you like, is not. Also, this is beaded wire. It's difficult to see proper beaded wire, and here is spiral beaded wire. Slightly more, do you see this is slightly more elaborate beaded wire here, the way it goes. Here it's much simpler, much starker. So again, we have two different goldsmiths working, two earrings that are presumably worn as a pair, and we just assume that the person lost one and had another one made. So there's so much that one can look at with jewellery. And even just taking basically as the basis of this talk, one piece of jewellery in the museum, you can start asking these questions. Now, you can't answer the questions, but you can certainly suggest where jewellery history can go. And I think that we're at a stage where we know most of the technology. We know how they made things pretty well. But what we don't know is the interlinks. How did it spread? Why does a lion-headed earring found in southern Italy look exactly the same as one found in South Russia? What were the connections? Did the goldsmiths travel? How did it work? We know so little about the actual mechanics, the goldsmiths, the development, the earrings we're talking about, the Eros earrings, the disc with the Eros below. As I said, I've probably seen about, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 dozen of these in my life, pairs of these earrings of this type. It must be possible to look at them and see how they differ and come up with some sort of chronological patterns, maybe geographical patterns, maybe you identify goldsmiths' hands. So there's a huge amount that can be done in jewellery. And this is what always annoys me, that people tend to think of jewellery as a minor art. But if you think about it, and I showed at the beginning a little figure in a terracotta Eros. That's one piece of clay made in a mold and painted. The equivalent in gold is using many dozens of separate components representing a vast number of different technologies. There's more goes into making gold jewellery than most other ancient art. And yet it still seems a minor art. It's not studied enough. So if anything, I hope I've explained to people that there's so much one can look at from jewellery. This is just scrape the surface of what can be looked at and what sort of questions we can start asking. There's a huge, huge future for the study of jewellery history. And I hope by seminars like this, by having pieces on show in museums and discussing them and opening the discussion, the subject can go forward. And of course, we don't know a lot about the customer themselves. That's yet to be found out, isn't it? We know a little bit from Greek plays about how the customers dealt with jewellery, how the women wore them, and so on. But it's another avenue to explore. There's a lot to learn. Thank you very much indeed.